The air in this place always feels so unbelievably heavy, pressing down on my lungs until every single breath becomes a conscious, painful effort. It is not just the physical temperature, though the sun beats down on our dry, cracked earth with a relentless fury that offers no shade and no mercy. It is a spiritual weight, a suffocating blanket of dread that wraps around my throat the moment I open my eyes each morning. I wipe the stinging sweat from my brow, feeling the rough grime of a world that has completely forgotten how to be clean. This suffocating, endless warmth is the only steady companion I have left in this desolate wasteland. And then there is the other kind of warmth, the one that never leaves my bones. The burning deep inside my chest when I watch the unnatural shadows pass by my narrow window. It is the fever of pure, paralyzing terror, but also a sick, terrible fascination that I cannot shake. We are losing ourselves here. Every passing day, I feel my own memories, my own family name, melting away under the crushing pressure of this twisted civilization. They demand our absolute surrender, and the fire in their unblinking eyes promises nothing but ash if we dare to refuse. The ground beneath my bare feet radiates with the spilled blood of forgotten generations, and that dreadful heat never, ever fades. You and I need to be completely honest about what really happened back then. If you read the oldest records of my people, you would picture a world so strange it sounds like a madman's fever dream. You would read about civilizations flourishing for centuries under the rule of beings that were completely alien to human nature. I have seen the ancient texts, written with cold mathematical precision, describing an era before the sky was torn open. Our Genesis records 1,600 years of human history between the garden and the flood, keeping exact track of our names and ages. 16 brutal centuries where violent, arrogant men simply refused to die. Imagine holding absolute, terrifying power for 800 years without ever losing your grip. The terrifying truth of how we got here is perfectly etched into those scrolls, and what they reveal keeps me awake in the dark. Our first taste of death was not some quiet sickness spreading in the night. It was not a tragic accident. It was cold, deliberate murder. The accounts say that Cain rose up in the field and slaughtered his own brother Abel, letting his fresh blood soak into the very dirt from which we were all formed. The very first thing my ancestors invented after losing paradise was not a wooden wheel or a safe shelter. It was pure, unadulterated violence. The Creator himself stepped down to confront Cain, offering him a single, precious chance to confess his brutal crime before the only witness whose eyes actually mattered. But the man felt absolutely nothing inside. Cain shed no tears for the younger brother he left bleeding in the dust, and he offered not a single ounce of genuine remorse to the Creator who stood right there watching him. Instead, he had the sheer audacity to complain. He whined that his punishment was simply too heavy to carry, acting as if he were the real victim in all of this. And then he made a choice that locked my generation into this inescapable nightmare. The ancient records tell us that Cain walked completely away from the presence of the Lord, wandering out into the desolate wilderness to settle in the distant land of Nod. That single rebellious step decided the dark fate of the next 16 centuries of my world. He crossed over to the east, far away from the borders of the garden we lost, and he decided to build something that had never existed on this earth. He constructed a sprawling city, the very first of its kind, and he built it entirely with hands that were still stained thick with his own brother's blood. He named this place Enoch, a twisted, arrogant monument to his own son. Walking through the streets of these cities today, I can physically feel the rotting foundation they were built upon. It is an undeclared but absolute rule we live by now. Every single war is waged without a single prayer for mercy. Every massive stone is hoisted into place without an altar or a sacrifice. It is a vast, suffocating civilization built completely without God. From the dark heart of that first city, a massive family line exploded outward, advancing at a speed that terrifies me every time I look around. The scrolls carefully trace Cain's descendants, and their names map out the exact structure of the prison we all live in today. Look at Lamech, the great-great-grandson of the first murderer. He was the very first man to completely shatter the sacred bond of marriage, forcefully taking 2 wives for himself. He brought Adah and Zillah into his tent, demanding twice the life that was meant for him. And from that broken, greedy union came the brilliant, twisted minds that would forge the sprawling industries of our ancient, dying world. We have been paying the bloody price for his arrogance ever since. His sons literally shaped the heavy chains that bind my people today. Jabal was the first to wander, becoming the father of everyone who lives in tents and herds livestock, birthing the massive nomadic empires that sweep across our dry plains. Then came Jubal, the father of all who play the harp and the sweet flute, the one who brought distracting music into our chaotic lives. But the most terrifying of all was Tubal-Cain. He was the absolute master of the forge, hammering out the first bronze and iron tools to cut through human flesh. The man who invented the very weapons that terrorize my family today grew up in the exact same tent as the man who invented music. The gentle lyre and the bloody sword were born under the same roof. In my daily life, beauty and violence absolutely do not oppose one another. They are twisted sister industries, feeding off the same dark energy, thriving right alongside each other in the shadows. The grand entertainment that mesmerizes our youth and the brutal wars that completely slaughter them were crafted by the exact same generation, with the exact same hands, sitting around the same ancient hearth. And it was there, perfectly surrounded by his terrifying children, that Lamech stood before his 2 wives and spoke the very first poem our scribes ever recorded. The old scrolls preserve his exact words, and just hearing them whispered aloud in the busy marketplace makes the hair on my arm stand straight up. He proudly announced that he had slaughtered a grown man just for leaving a scratch on him, and that he had crushed the life out of a young boy for merely striking him. He stood there chest puffed out, declaring that if the Creator avenged Cain 7 times, then the bloody vengeance of Lamech would be 77 times greater. The very first piece of poetry ever etched into our human history is not a beautiful song of praise or a tearful lament. It is a twisted murder ballad. It is the chilling sound of a tyrant boasting about murdering a child with his bare hands. He felt absolutely no shame, only a sickening pride, treating his unnatural capacity for absolute violence as if it were his greatest, most honorable achievement. Yet, even as I hide out from the towering shadows of Cain's brutal descendants, I cling tightly to a quiet hope that runs exactly parallel to this madness. Our texts record this fragile second path with the same careful precision. The scrolls say that our mother Eve gave birth to another boy, naming him Seth, a promised seed to replace the innocent one who was murdered in the field. For centuries, these 2 totally opposing forces have walked the exact same dirt simultaneously. While the arrogant children of Cain built towering, blood-stained cities that completely forgot the Creator, the quiet children of Seth kept the old ways alive. My ancestors bowed their heads in the dust, desperately preserving true worship while the world burned. It was from Seth's quiet family that a man named Enoch emerged, and he is the only bright light in this suffocating era. He is the absolutely only man in our ruined world who managed to slip right through the terrifying jaws of death. The records say he simply walked closely with the Creator, stepping in perfect rhythm with the divine. until one day he just vanished because God mercifully took him away. He was a living, breathing proof that another way was still possible. That same faithful family gave us Methuselah, who has lingered on this harsh earth for 969 years, bearing silent witness to everything. And Methuselah's grandson is Noah, the very last fragile name we have before the crushing waters finally come. Just think about what happens when you combine that kind of impossibly long life with the ruthless, bloody lineage of Cain. The reality that stands right before my eyes every day is enough to completely break a person's mind. Try to imagine a man like Lamech, a violent, greedy warlord with multiple wives and a heart completely devoid of any mercy. Now realize that this monster does not simply wither away and die at 70 or 80 years old like you might expect. I have to watch these powerful men live for centuries. They just keep accumulating endless miles of territory, hundreds of trembling wives, and massive stockpiles of forged weapons. There is no natural death to snap their dark reign, no frail old age to loosen their grip. I walk past the same towering stone walls my great-grandfather walked past, ruled by the exact same immortal tyrant who has held this bruised land for 500, 600, 700 years without a single pause. In a normal reality, the worst dictators are eventually stopped by the quiet mercy of the grave. But out here, under this ancient sky, that limit simply does not exist at all. A wicked, bloodthirsty ruler can suffocate an entire region for far longer than most empires are ever meant to stand. I watch generation after generation of ordinary, fragile people like me being born, weeping and dying, all while living entirely under the darkest shadow of the exact same eternal oppressor. There is absolutely no hope for a generational change. Stick with me here, because you and I need to look at how dark this truly got. Try to comprehend pure evil compounding upon itself, learning, perfecting its cruelty for 8 straight centuries inside a single human mind, without the reset of death to ever wipe the slate clean. That was my everyday reality before the rain finally started to fall. And just when I thought the darkness could not press any heavier on my tired chest, it got so much worse in a way that our texts describe with disturbing accuracy. Something unnatural pushed its way into our fragile world, tearing violently right through the absolute boundaries the Creator had set. That terrible crossing infected every single thing it touched at a completely unstoppable speed. The sacred words perfectly state what I watched happen with my own terrified eyes. As our fragile human population swelled and spread across the dusty plains, the ones the scrolls call the sons of God looked down from above. They saw the mortal daughters of my people. They saw their delicate beauty. And they simply decided to take whichever ones they desired to be their wives. The old Hebrew texts call them the Ben Elohim, and trust me, not a single person in my village is confused about what that actually means. The ancient writings of Job use that exact same name to describe the majestic beings who stand in the divine courts. We are talking about the angelic council, abandoning their holy posts to walk right among us in the dirt. I have heard the cowardly scholars in the marketplace trying to rationalize the nightmare we are living in. They desperately whisper that these sons of God are just the righteous boys from Seth's family, or maybe just arrogant human kings claiming to hold divine authority. But the overwhelming terror in the streets proves a much darker truth. The later texts of Jude capture exactly what happened, recording that these were angels who abandoned their proper, holy stations. They walked away from their heavenly dwellings forever, trading the eternal light for the filthy pleasures of our cursed soil. Because of what they did to us, they are no longer free. They are chained in absolute darkness, screaming into the abyss as they await judgment. What these divine beings did to our women and our sacred bloodlines was so deeply perverse that the Creator could not just hand down a simple punishment. He completely eradicated them from the board. He dragged them down into the deepest, blackest abyss and chained them up so tightly they could never, ever repeat their crimes against my people. The writings of Peter firmly confirm this, swearing that God absolutely did not spare the angels when they sinned, throwing them directly into the dark. And those exact same verses tie their ultimate punishment straight to Noah and the terrifying floodwaters that washed my entire world away. It was a direct chain of events. They deliberately crossed a cosmic boundary, and we all paid the ultimate price. These towering, terrifying angelic beings abandoned their natural, holy station. They forced their way into my delicate world using twisted methods the Creator never designed and absolutely never permitted, and the brutal result was entirely catastrophic. Our scrolls firmly record that the Nephilim walked the earth in those days, born when those divine beings took the human daughters into their tents. We call them the fallen ones, the unnatural abominations who plummeted from the sky without permission. The ancient tongue calls them Gibborim. They were the mighty men, the brutal champions of war, possessing a bone-crushing physical strength that no ordinary human being had ever witnessed, or could ever hope to possibly survive against. The texts call them men of renown, but in my native tongue, they are simply known as the men of the name. They were towering nightmares whose violent fame filled the entire continent with a paralyzing astonishment. These are the twisted monsters that your later civilizations will wrongly worship as glorious demigods and golden heroes of a forgotten past. But you try living next to them. Do you have any idea what it feels like to cower in your mud brick home, while their massive footsteps literally shake the hard ground beneath your bare feet? Even centuries later, when the Israelite spies stumbled across their lingering descendants in the land of Canaan, they felt the exact same absolute terror that I am forced to feel every single day. Those later spies in Canaan were nothing more than a faint, distant echo of the nightmare I was born into. The records of Numbers preserve their desperate, trembling voices. They told their leaders that they felt like tiny, insignificant grasshoppers in their own eyes, and that the giants looked down on them exactly the same way. But what those terrified Israelites saw was just a tiny remnant. It was a faded, watered-down shadow of what lived and breathed in my world before the heavy rains came in its most complete and terrifying form. In my brutal era, these towering, bloodthirsty freaks were not some rare anomaly hiding out in a distant, forgotten valley. They were absolutely everywhere, and they completely dominated everything. Put yourself in my shoes for just a second. Picture stepping out of your front door and encountering one of them in the narrow street. The hard dirt physically trembling under their heavy boots as they reach out and take whatever they desire. Imagine the suffocating reality of knowing that absolutely no human being on the entire planet possesses the physical strength to withstand what these beings decide to do. These were not spooky fireside stories meant to scare our wandering children. They were our actual neighbors. They were our governors, the absolute kings of our doomed reality. And regular, fragile men like me were, as the Hebrew spies themselves said, exactly like locusts waiting to be crushed under their massive feet. I used to think they just came down here out of pure, unchecked lust. But this violent incursion was never random or accidental. It had a highly strategic direction that the ancient texts reveal with absolute clarity. Think back to the very beginning, to the promise the Creator made in the garden right after we fell. He didn't speak it directly to Adam or Eve. He looked right at the serpent. He swore to put a bitter enmity between the beast and the woman, promising that a future descendant of her pure bloodline would violently crush the serpent's head. That is the very first prophecy ever recorded in the sacred scrolls. The desperate promise of a completely human savior who would eventually come to break our chains and set us free. That prophecy demanded a very specific, purely human genetic line that was meant to remain perfectly intact. The terrifying invasion of the Nephilim was a direct, calculated military attack against the very family tree that carried the sacred seed of the Messiah. I realize now that if they managed to completely poison the human genome with their angelic blood, the promised seed could never be born fully human, as the prophecy strictly required. The enemy was desperately trying to eliminate the Savior long before his arrival by fundamentally corrupting the raw, human material necessary for his birth. I am standing squarely in the middle of a cosmic war for my own identity, waiting for a flood that I pray will wash this nightmare away. I remember looking around and realizing this was no ordinary decay. It was a calculated, cosmic invasion of everything good. The skies felt heavy and the air itself seemed poisoned. God saw it all, every shadowed corner of the earth. His verdict in Genesis chapter 6 was terrifyingly precise, leaving no room for me or anyone else to misunderstand. The wickedness wasn't just a habit, it was an absolute takeover of the human heart. Every thought, every intention, every fleeting desire was twisted. I watched my neighbors, my friends, consumed by it. It was never a passing phase. It wasn't just bad behavior on weekends. It was entirely, continually, suffocatingly evil. And I had to live in the middle of it, wondering if I would be swallowed up too. Genesis chapter 6, verses 11 and 12, confirms that the whole earth was rotting right in front of my eyes. It wasn't just the cities. The corruption bled into the soil, infecting even the animals, until every living thing was locked in a cycle of endless violence. And then I felt something I had never sensed before: the Creator's own heartbreak. The God I prayed to wasn't just angry, he was devastated. It is the most crushing realization to know that the Maker of the stars looked down at the men and women he formed from dust. And he actually regretted making us. I could feel his deep, agonizing grief echoing in my own chest. It wasn't fury that drove his judgment. It was the profound sorrow of a father mourning his lost world. People think it was a furious deity throwing fire down from the clouds, but I felt the truth. This was a father standing in the pitch-black darkness, weeping over children he could no longer recognize. After centuries of relentless cruelty, every trace of his image had been scraped away from their faces. It felt so incredibly lonely, standing in a sea of millions of violent souls, knowing the Maker of the universe was watching it all fall apart. But somehow in that unimaginable darkness, his eyes found me. Genesis chapter 6, verses 8 and 9, records that out of millions of corrupted hearts I found grace. I felt his presence wrap around me, pulling me back from the edge of the abyss that was swallowing everyone else alive. They called me a just man, perfect in my generation. But let me tell you, carrying that title felt like a death sentence. To be just in a generation, completely sold out to blood and darkness, was exhausting. The word they used was tamim, which means complete and pure. My bloodline hadn't mixed with the giants, the Nephilim, the fallen ones who were tearing civilization apart. But maintaining that purity meant living in constant, terrifying isolation. What did it actually mean to be me in that era? It meant walking through a world of total moral collapse and pretending the madness wasn't normal. It meant staring into the face of utter depravity and holding onto an invisible standard, while the pressure to just give in nearly broke my mind every day. It is a terrifying thing to wake up every single morning knowing your house is the only one on earth where prayers are still spoken. I walked past the glowing forges and the massive temples of a society that had completely erased God from their memories. Neighbors openly screamed curses at the sky, laughing when no fire fell to strike them down. I watched little children witnessing unspeakable horrors in the streets, and nobody blinked because right and wrong had vanished. I walked through those crowded, rotting markets with my head down, feeling the immense gravity of my solitude. I had to keep walking, I had to keep praying. I had to somehow keep believing in a silent God, when every piece of physical evidence told me I was completely insane. And then, after years of that deafening silence, the Creator finally spoke to me. The words he said in Genesis chapter 6, verses 13 and 14, were so terrifying they almost brought me to my knees in the dirt. He told me he had decided to bring an end to all living flesh. The violence had tipped the scale, and he was going to wipe them entirely from the earth. Then he gave me an instruction that made absolutely no sense in my world. He told me to build an ark out of gopher wood, to divide it into rooms, and to seal it tight with pitch. I stood there, a solitary, tired man, trying to process a command that defied all logic. How was I supposed to build a massive mountain of wood in the dust? The fear of the task ahead was crushing me. He gave me the blueprints with cold, technical precision. 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high. 3 massive decks, 1 single door. It was roughly 137 meters long, 23 meters wide, and 14 meters high. Try to imagine the crushing weight of that assignment on my shoulders. I was just a man, tasked with constructing a colossal wooden vessel on bone-dry land, for a world that had never even seen a drop of rain. I was measuring timber for an apocalyptic catastrophe that had zero precedent in human memory. Every time I looked at the sheer scale of the measurements, my hands shook. I was building a monument to global death, staring up at a sky that refused to offer even a single cloud as proof. There was no word for flood in our language. There was no cultural reference, no natural disaster I could point to and say, "This is what is coming." Every single plank I cut, every massive wooden beam I hoisted into place was an excruciating act of blind faith. My daily labor became a physical sermon, and the entire city watched me with absolute, sneering disdain. Every year without rain gave them another reason to call me a madman stranded by a boat in the dust. The scholars estimate that the construction took between 55 and 75 years of continuous work without converting anyone. Decades of heavy lifting, decades of bleeding hands, decades of pleading with people who just laughed in my face and went back to their violence. The rhythm of my life back then was an endless, exhausting cycle. 75 years of rhythmic hammering. 75 years of desperately shouting warnings into the streets. 75 years of watching every single person roll their eyes and walk away. Imagine preaching for 75 years, and not a single soul outside of your own small family believes you. Not one neighbor, not one person from that ancient city ever came to me and said, "I believe you, Noah, tell me how to survive." The isolation was an absolute agony. I was entirely alone with the truth, trapped in a sprawling city of the walking dead who thought they were the ones who were truly alive, mocking the only lifeline God had provided for our doomed world. Do not think for a second that I never doubted. When the sun went down and the sky was a blanket of quiet stars, the whispers of madness would creep into my head. I watched my neighbors pass by the scaffolding day after day, and the grief of knowing they were all about to perish was unbearable. All I could do was wake up, grip my hammer, and swallow the fear. And then the day came. Genesis chapter 7, verse 14. records the instruction that finally paralyzed my faithful heart with terror. The Creator told me to enter the ark with all my family. The finality of it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I had to look at my wife and sons and tell them it was time to step into the dark belly of a wooden giant, leaving the world behind. He gave us exactly 7 days, one final, breathless week of grace, warning that it would rain for 40 days and 40 nights. And then the impossible happened. Out of the dust on the horizon, they began to arrive. I didn't hunt them, I didn't herd them. 7 pairs of the clean animals, 2 of the unclean walking alone and in silence out of the wilderness. They marched toward the ark, completely unguided by human hands, drawn by the invisible pull of their maker. I stood near the massive ramp, trembling, as predators and prey walked side by side. The townspeople gathered, pointing and staring at the bizarre parade, completely blind to the horror it signaled. They were watching their own death march, and they didn't even understand it. Those final 7 days were sheer psychological torture. The animals were safely inside, and I stood by the open door, watching my neighbors. Some were still laughing, drinking, tossing rocks at the timber without feeling the danger. Others looked slightly uneasy, staring at the gathered beasts, but pride kept them from taking that one final step up the ramp. The ground beneath my feet was still dry as dust. The heavens were a mocking, brilliant blue. Not a single cloud, just 7 days of silence from the sky while humanity stood around the strangest spectacle in its history. The tension in my gut was tighter than a bowstring. I felt the crushing weight of knowing time had practically run out, yet everything outside looked perfectly normal. We walked into the shadows of the middle deck, as God had commanded. And then Genesis chapter 7, verse 16, records the most decisive moment of the entire era. God himself shut the heavy wooden door from the outside. I didn't touch it, my sons didn't pull it. The Creator sealed us in. In that split second, the long period of grace was violently terminated. Everyone left on the outside was locked out forever, with absolutely no court of appeal. Inside, the heavy pitch sealed away the light. We could hear the mockery from the crowd, beyond the wood finally die out. And then, for the first time in 1,600 years of human noise, an unnatural, breathless silence fell over the earth. My heart pounded so hard I thought my ribs would crack. The silence shattered. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, records that the sky didn't just rain, it literally tore wide open. We heard a deafening roar as all the springs of the great abyss violently burst forth, fracturing the earth beneath us. At the exact same second, the windows of the heavens opened, pouring down crushing sheets of water. It was absolute, blinding chaos. I realized with creeping dread that this was not a storm. This was the deliberate, systematic undoing of everything God had spoken into existence. Just as in Genesis chapter 1, where he separated the waters, he was now collapsing the firmament, merging them back together. The massive vessel lurched, groaning under the sheer, brutal impact of an ocean falling from the sky. The water rose with a terrifying, merciless speed. Genesis chapter 7, verse 19, records that the waters prevailed so violently that all the high mountains were completely covered to a depth of 15 cubits. Every grand city, every towering monument of pride, every blazing forge of Tubal-Cain where they had crafted their weapons, gone. The opulent palaces where the descendants of Lamech had reigned for centuries were dragged down into the freezing, breathless deep forever. I sat trembling in the belly of the ship, knowing that just outside those pitch-covered walls, God was actively wiping out every single living thing on the face of the earth. The sheer magnitude of the global destruction was completely paralyzing to my fragile mind. The mighty men, the beasts, the reptiles, and the birds of the sky wiped away like dust, It was just us left alive. My family huddled together, eating our cold rations in the suffocating darkness of the lower decks. We were floating over a submerged graveyard that covered the entire globe. The only sounds left were the endless pounding of the rain against the roof, the violent crashing of the dark waves, the terrifying groans of the wooden beams, and the haunting silence of a civilization that had ceased to exist. The sheer terror of that first night is something I will never be able to erase from my mind. The heavy door was locked from the outside by God Himself, and everyone I had ever known was dead in the freezing water. That heavy, unnatural silence outside the timber meant something that almost broke my sanity. It meant there was no one left treading water, no one left gasping for air, no one left to scream. The entire world had finally choked and gone quiet. Every neighbor who used to mock my warnings, every craftsman I traded with, every child who played in those ancient dirt streets, completely erased. All the brilliant, wicked humanity I had observed for decades, washed away in 40 days of relentless, unyielding judgment. I sat in the damp darkness of that wooden cell, shivering, carrying the impossible psychological weight of being the sole survivor. I had warned them for 75 years, but now I was completely alone with the ghosts of the old world. Just when I thought the damp dark would drive me completely mad, Genesis chapter 8, verse 1 utters the words that changed everything. The waters began to recede. We felt the massive jolt as the hull scraped and rested onto the jagged mountains of Ararat. I stood at the window, desperate for any sign of life, and sent out a raven, then a dove. When that delicate bird finally returned to my calloused hands with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak, I fell to my knees weeping. Life was actually returning. The ground reappeared beneath a slowly clearing sky. Genesis chapter 8, verse 20, states that the absolute first thing I did when I stepped out of that vessel and felt solid, dry earth under my shaking feet was build an altar to the Lord. When I looked out over the barren, washed landscape, my first thought wasn't survival or building a shelter. I didn't rush to establish a new city or map out trade routes to make a name for myself. I needed an altar. I needed the fire and the sacrifice. It was the exact opposite of what Cain did when he fled from the presence of God and desperately built a city named after his son to hide his fear. Cain sought security in walls. I sought it in the dirt, returning to the Lord. As the smoke rose, the air shifted. And Genesis chapter 9, verse 11, records the new covenant God established. He swore a solemn oath that never again would all flesh be violently cut off by the dark waters of a universal flood. The deep, lingering fear began to break. He painted his sign directly across the bruised sky. It wasn't just a pretty arc of colors as a decoration for children's books. It was a terrifying weapon of war. The Hebrew word he used for it was the very same word we used for the battle bow that fires arrows of death. Only this bow was unstrung, inverted, and aimed directly up into the heart of the heavens. It was the mark of a blood covenant. The Creator was making a staggering declaration to my trembling heart. The rainbow does not just say that the storm is over. It means that the next time the wrath of heaven is required to deal with human corruption, God Himself will take the arrow. He will pay the brutal price in His own divine flesh. The flood had ended, but the great war had not. But as the years passed, a cold, sickening realization settled into my bones. The roaring waters had drowned the giants and the wicked men, but they had not drowned the darkness. Sin had sneaked right onto the ark. It was hiding in the beating hearts of my own sons. I saw it resurrect with my own eyes in the quiet disgrace of Ham. Later in the defiance of the Tower of Babel and in the curse of Canaan. The physical seed of humanity had been preserved, but the ancient enemy was still fully alive inside of us. The flood answered the deepest, most desperate question of existence. Can humanity be saved by simply washing the world clean and starting over? The answer was a devastating no. The issue was never the environment or the culture around us. The real, insurmountable problem was the human heart itself. And that deep sickness required a completely different kind of rescue, one that no amount of floodwater could ever provide. I couldn't build a wooden boat big enough to save us from ourselves. 2,000 years after the flood, Jesus would sit on the dust of the Mount of Olives and point his followers straight back in time to my life. He looked back through the centuries at the violence, the mockery, the closed door, and the sudden, terrifying judgment, drawing a perfectly precise comparison. He knew exactly what it felt like to be surrounded by a world that refused to wake up until the sky broke open, and he knew he would be the true ark for humanity. I stared down at the pages of my Bible, reading Matthew 24, and a cold shiver runs down my spine. The words blur, and suddenly I can almost smell the ancient, dry dust of the earth. Jesus said that the end of days wouldn't look like the fire of Sodom or the slave pits of Egypt. He pointed directly to the days of Noah. I look out my window at our world today, and I feel the exact same crushing dread those ancient people must have felt. They were just eating, drinking, getting married, living completely normal lives while the sky prepared to break open. Jesus chose the most corrupt, violent, and spiritually dead generation in all of human history as our mirror, and the terrifying part, I feel that same heavy, suffocating pressure closing in on me right now. You and I need to look at this closely, because this isn't just a historical warning. It is an absolute, terrifying guarantee of what is coming. When I walk through the crowded streets today, the isolation is deafening. I realize the most frightening word in that entire prophecy isn't the flood. It's the word unprepared. They weren't all running around shaking their fists at the heavens in violent rebellion. They just slipped into the numbness of routine. That realization hits me like a physical blow. Because I fight that exact same temptation every single morning. They didn't actively plot to reject their Creator. They just let the noise of life drown him out until they completely stopped paying attention. I am terrified of letting myself go numb like that. Every morning I wake up and see the gathering clouds of evidence, right out in the open, just like they did. You could hear the massive timbers of the ark being hammered into place every single afternoon. Yet the people deliberately looked the other way until the freezing water finally washed over their ankles. I feel so incredibly alone when I see how perfectly our modern world mirrors their ancient madness. What made their generation the ultimate blueprint for the end of time? It was the cold, hollow pursuit of technology stripped entirely of God. I can almost hear the ringing iron from the ancient forges. Of Tubal Cain, the mesmerizing, seductive music of Jubal that hypnotized the masses. They built empires of pleasure and power, but they never fell to their knees in worship. I feel the pressure crushing my chest every time I turn on a screen. Watching violence served up as mindless entertainment, echoing the ancient, arrogant boasting of Lamech. It is like the terrifying dominion of the Nephilim all over again, a society that violently worships raw power and utterly despises weakness. I watch feeling completely helpless, as the sacred boundaries God carefully established are mocked, erased, and deliberately tangled in rebellion. The true horror of that pre-flood world wasn't just the sheer scale of their depravity. It was that the evil became relentlessly ordinary. It faded into the mundane background noise of a casual Tuesday afternoon. No one even noticed the rot anymore, because there was absolutely nothing pure left to compare it to. I try to hold onto my identity, but but it is terrifying when society has entirely lost its moral compass, leaving no true north to show us how far we have drifted. I imagine the sheer, heartbreaking isolation of being that one lonely voice crying out while the crowd just laughs. A solitary man dragging heavy timber, building a massive ship of salvation, while his neighbors casually walked by without a second glance. Stick with me here, because there is a breathtaking detail in this story that completely wrecked me. It is about Methuselah, the oldest man who ever lived. Ancient scholars tell us his very name carried a heavy, terrifying prophecy. When he dies, the promised judgment will strike the earth, and the exact year Methuselah finally took his last breath. The sky broke open. His fragile, aging body was a literal walking countdown clock, ticking away for 969 years. Every step he took was a living sign of the agonizing patience of God, written into the identity of a man who wandered the dust until the window of grace finally slammed shut. When I read 2 Peter chapter 3, my eyes fill with tears. It says the Lord is not dragging his feet on his promises. He is just bearing the pain of patience, desperate for no one to perish. It shatters my heart to realize God endured 1,600 years of our venom. He sent Enoch to warn us. He sent Noah to build. He placed a prophecy of total annihilation into a baby's name, and then allowed that man to live nearly a millennium just to give us one more day to turn back. I have to remind myself, especially when the world feels so hostile, that this is not the behavior of a furious dictator. It is the weeping heartbreak of a patient father, begging his children to come home, offering every conceivable chance. But even perfect patience must eventually draw a line in the sand. Not because his love runs dry, but because his absolute justice demands it. I can almost hear the horrifying, heavy thud of that massive wooden door sealing shut. Once it closed, it was over. No desperate appeals, no frantic last-minute bargaining while the freezing rain started to fall. In the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks directly to my deepest fears. He says, "I am the door. Anyone who walks through me will be saved from the dark waters and finally find abundant life." The crushing pressure to conform fades away when I realize that Jesus himself is our ark. He is the solitary door left in this chaotic wasteland. And by some miracle of grace, that door is still standing open right now. The exact same God who endured 1,600 years of mockery before releasing the floodwaters is watching us, holding back the storm. He is not slow, he is agonizingly patient with us. Noah stood in the dirt and pleaded with his neighbors for decades, offering them salvation until the sky turned black and all negotiation violently ended. You and I are looking at this together today for a profound reason. I truly believe with all my fragile heart that it is no accident or random computer algorithm that brought you to this exact moment of desperate warning. I feel the weight of eternity pressing down on my shoulders as I realize the Creator who spoke through Noah, who used Methuselah's very life as a ticking clock, is desperately whispering to us right now. The agonizing question isn't whether that doorway of escape actually exists. The terrifying question is whether I will have the courage to step through it, or if I will just stand frozen in the crowd until it slams shut forever. In the absolute blackest, most lonely era of human existence, one broken man managed to find grace, a single family survived the deluge, and one wooden door was entirely enough. If walking through this ancient terror has awakened a hunger inside you, stay with me. Subscribe and let us keep walking through this spiritual wasteland together. I refuse to let my identity be swallowed up by a society that is practically begging to be washed away. My greatest fear is becoming numb, just drifting along with the endless, blinding noise of a culture that mocks anything holy. but we do not have to drown in their collective amnesia. There is still solid ground to be found if we are willing to seek it out before the rain starts falling. We are going to dig deep into the sacred, ancient mysteries that this arrogant, dying world has deliberately chosen to forget. We will uncover the truth, hold fast to our faith, and ensure we are standing safely inside the ark when the final storm breaks.